Hi, I'm Zachary Hunter. Welcome to the Explain It To Me podcast. EITMPod is about info without gatekeeping, encouraging curiosity, community, and education, without drowning in jargon. This is the second episode about marriage that we're doing here. The first was about the legal definition of marriage, along with some of its benefits. Today, I'm not going to talk as a certified financial planner with a license to practice law. Instead, I'm going to approach this from a different perspective, one of theology and canon law, or church law. Now here's where I'm coming from. First, I am not a priest, deacon, or any sort of monk, and while I am an attorney, I am not a licensed canon lawyer. I am a happily married layperson, and I do not have the authority to speak on behalf of the Catholic Church. What I do have, instead, is a Master's of Arts in Theology from one of the top Catholic seminaries in the United States, and I did do very well there. So I thought I could use that to give you some insight on how Catholics and Orthodox, aka about 60% of Christians, officially think about marriage. I want to be clear that I'm not going to use this show now or at any time to convince you that the Catholic/Orthodox view of marriage is the only way to look at matrimony, or try to convert you. This episode is not about what you do on Sunday, or where you go for it. But what I think this show can provide is a useful approach to see what marriage is according to the religion/philosophy that over 1 in 8 people on this planet claim they believe. And that I might be able to explain it in a way that's more approachable than just a simple Google search. I think getting some straight information about what Catholics and even most Orthodox officially believe about getting married might help explain things when you hear in the news, for example, about the Church's view on divorce, annulments, or even prenuptial agreements, aka prenups. Plus, I think someone who can both read the law and has taken classes on this particular topic, but also talk like an actual person instead of just a lawyer, might help explain things when it comes to issues of canon law. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's get into the basics of what the Church argues marriage actually is. So, this red book right here is called the Code of Canon Law. There's also this blue one called the Code of the Canons of the Eastern Churches, which is meant for the 24 Catholic churches that aren't, quote, Roman Catholic. That's groups such as the Ukrainian Catholics, Maronites from Lebanon, and Byzantine/Ruthenian Catholics. And that blue book is based on the traditional laws and rules of Eastern Christianity at large, including Eastern and Oriental Orthodox and what they follow. In the red book, the Code of Canon Law, which you often see abbreviated as CIC, it defines marriage philosophically as such. It's like this. CIC 1055 Section 1, so this is the red book, Canon 1055, quote, the matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and of which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, end quote. Now, let's break that down a little. What does it mean by covenant? Well, in the Western Code, so for Roman Catholics, the word is used about 3 times, while contract is used about 40. In Eastern Christianity, the Blue Book and various Eastern and Oriental Orthodox documents, covenant is the go-to word, as it implies a real agreement that is more than just the secular slash legalistic one. A sacred reality with an emphasis on mutual commitment that, like a contract law, emphasizes mutual rights and obligations, but gets at something more from the Church's, and more broadly Christian, perspective. That bit of, quote, a partnership of the whole of life, end quote, gets to it being indissoluble cannot be dissolved or divided while the spouses are alive. And I'll get to that more in a moment. But to understand how marriage operates in a Christian context, one has to understand what its goals, what its ends are, to use that language. I already used CIC 1055's language, so I'll use a line from a document called Gaudium et Spes, which is one of the documents from the so-called Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, from the 1960s. It used the phrases, quote, "By their very nature, the institution of matrimony itself and conjugal love are ordained for the procreation and education of children, and find in their ultimate crown," end quote. Find in them their ultimate crown. So, from a Catholic, and basically speaking Orthodox Christian perspective, the goals are, 1, the good of the spouses, and the good of the offspring. That offspring bit, by the way, was traditionally just about procreation. But in Vatican II, the Catholic Church included this idea of marriage being a vehicle or means for the education of children, and that plus any prior union, for example, second marriage. Notice what's not there. Love. Marriage in the Christian context is not about love, at least not romantic love. Christ's love, sure, but that's Christianity generally, but it's not romantic love here exactly. Love is secondary, and something one likes to see there. But matrimony is not about two people loving each other. It is about consent. The priests in the church are not looking to see if this couple loves each other. They are confirming the exchange of consent. Consenting to a lifelong partnership is why, by the way, the church is against prenups as a rule, given that you're not freely and fully consenting to such a union if it's conditioned, like it would generally be with a prenuptial agreement. Now, it isn't the only thing that matters to the church, but consent is the biggest thing. Because when both people are not baptized, while it is by definition not a Christian sacramental marriage, more on that later, it can and is presumed to be a valid marriage, unless it is found out not to be. Because even among non-baptized, Catholics argue the natural kind of marriage between people who just exist together is still indissoluble. At least while both spouses are alive, they are really married. And the thing this all boils down to is, to quote Canon 1057, Western Code, Section 1, is, quote, "The consent of the parties legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law makes marriage. No human power is able to supply this consent," end quote. And to continue on to Section 2 of that same canon, this is again 1057, quote, "Matrimonial consent is an act of the will by which a man and a woman mutually give and accept each other through an irrevocable covenant in order to establish marriage." Okay, a lot there. So how real people talk, if both sides understand what they are agreeing to, and note that doesn't mean they have to see the future or know or / expect all the bumps ahead, just what they are doing at that moment, and that they are free to make that decision at that time and place. That consent, all else being equal, makes it a valid marriage, even between one or more non-Christians, assuming everything else makes it valid. Assuming nothing else makes it invalid. Now, if they are both baptized, however, they would therefore both be Christian, and the otherwise real and fully valid on its own natural marriage is, quote, "consecrated and strengthened by sacramental grace," end quote. To quote that blue book, the Eastern Church Canons, number 776, section 2. So what does that mean? Okay. Think of it this way. Two Catholics, a Catholic and Orthodox, one of those two, and a Protestant. and or two Protestants wanting to get married together. Assuming no other problems like invalid baptism or not following any of the other requirements being at play, then when they get hitched, they are not just married. They are sacramentally married. I can get more into what makes a sacrament in another episode, but basically, it is a sign, an outward sign in the world, showing the blessings and the graces conveyed by that thing because of God. For an example, the priest standing in for Christ, saying, "Your sins are forgiven," is a sign that your sins are forgiven, and in many ways the manner in which they are forgiven. So for two Christians, them being married sacramentally, aka according to the teaching of the church over the last 2 millennia, it would give them the strength and graces to live a Christian married life by the very act of entering into a Christian marriage. Think of it this way. Imagine getting your uniform on, or putting on an assigned bulletproof vest. It doesn't mean Christian marriage is going to be more of a marriage. It means a Christian marriage is better able, because of it being a sacrament, to be a marriage between two Christians, to be a Christian marriage. And it is very much about the couple and God helping them out. In Eastern Christianity, both Orthodox and Eastern Catholic, the wedding needs a priest or bishop to bless the union for it to be valid, which we'll touch on later when we get to discuss the proper canonical form of a wedding. But the ministers of the sacrament, aka who's doing God's work at that time, in both East and West, is the spouses themselves, or are the spouses themselves. Because of that lack of requirement the East has, is why Roman Catholics allow deacons to witness/perform marriages, when neither Christian would be spouses an Eastern Christian. If one of them is an Eastern Christian, you need a priest or a bishop. But before I move on to everyone's favorite topic of divorce, let's touch on those essential properties again, as the issue at hand is not just about indissolubility, the undivided about, but about unity of the folks wanting to get hitched. Unity means one, so polygamy gets ruled out real fast in the Christian context, and so does having an affair, which would be adultery. What doesn't get ruled out, and in fact is presumed, is that the marriage gets the benefit of the doubt. Canon 1058 for Roman Catholics and 778 for Easterners says, anyone not otherwise prohibited from marrying should be able to marry. Similarly, Canon 779, the next one, for Easterners, and 1060 for Roman/Latin Catholics, says any apparent marriage is presumed to be valid until it is proven otherwise. And this is where we get into divorces and annulments. Because if you are validly married to someone still alive, you are not free to marry again. Otherwise, it would be polygamy. And if you're having conjugal relations with someone who's not your, quote, actual spouse, end quote, then you're committing adultery. Okay, I'm not going to get into the rare exceptions the church can annul an otherwise valid marriage for the sake of one of the spouses becoming a better Christian, baptism and the like. But if you ever hear about Petrine or Pauline privilege, it has to do with that, basically. But generally, you cannot get divorced and remarried while your spouse is in what is still believed to be a valid, much less sacramental marriage. If they're still alive, can happen, full stop. Notice again, divorce and remarried. That's important here. Separation is not banned by the church. It's the remarriage while alive. It's the having relations outside of that union that the church cares about. Now, as the child of a couple that had a Catholic wedding, but after getting legally divorced, an investigation occurred and the church found there had never been a real marriage, a sacramental marriage. I wanted to get some things out of the way. First, there is no issue, according to the church, of me or any child of any union like me, given my biological parents, being in not a real union, making me illegitimate, or to use the term, a bastard. Canon 1137, along with 1061 section 3, is explicit that a child conceived or born of even a marriage where at least one side entered into it in good faith, unless and until the union has been found to have always been null and void, aka annulled or annulment, they are legitimate to the extent that that matters. Put simply, even if there was never a real sacramental marriage, it does not hurt the kids in any way. Divorce can be really rough on kids, but an annulment is not, I repeat, not a Catholic or Orthodox divorce. Nor is it a way to retroactively turn your kids into being born out of wedlock, to use that phrase. It is no more a divorce than a lawsuit over a breach of contract claim is itself a contract, or a last will and testament working through the probate courts is the same as someone dying and wanting their money to go to the children. An annulment is a legal process, sure, and so is divorce. But a civil divorce tries to separate assets and undo a union, while an annulment is an investigation into whether there was ever a specific kind of union in the first place. Divorce is about destroying something. An annulment is about seeing, one, if it ever really happened in the first place, and two, possibly freeing the supposed spouses to be with a person they love, who they want to marry. An annulment is not a Catholic divorce. It is not even the church legitimizing a civil divorce after the fact. Those things are merely legal issues. Instead, an annulment is about seeking truth and freedom. Now, because an annulment is not just the church saying such and such divorce was okay, but rather about examining if there was really a sacramental marriage at all, I wanted to say a brief word about why that matters. Until recently, all Christians were opposed to divorce. Yes, even Henry VIII's Church of England, now called Anglicans or Episcopalians, were against divorce, as Jesus in the Gospels talks way more about divorce, adultery, and the spiritual/legal realities around them regarding those things, more than almost any other specific moral topic. Eastern and Oriental Orthodox, given that they, by tradition, cap the number of marriages in your life to 3, one with the full ceremony, crowns and all, one the union gets blessed, and one being tolerated provided other conditions are met. The legal annulment process doesn't matter as much unless one wants the bigger ceremony and the public legitimacy for the subsequent relationship. The Catholic Church, however, in the West especially, but in the Eastern churches in communion, such as Ukrainian Catholics and Ruthenians and the Byzantine Church of America as well, is far more detailed-oriented in terms of a legal process, clearing people to marry. I could guess that this is because the West not having a lifetime cap might have to do with how Western Europe versus Eastern Europe dealt with the Black Death and or high maternal mortality over the 1,000 years where East and West were separated. But I think it is a more general law-based approach that dominated in the Latin West compared to the Greek and Syriac East. Okay, so what then could keep you from marrying, such that it would be grounds for the church to, quote, make a declaration of nullity, aka grant an annulment? So, in the last video, I discussed already what's called consanguinity, or togetherness of blood, aka being too closely related. I did that in the last episode, but Canon 1091, or 808 for the Easterners, also touches on that, so I won't get into that here. And there are also similar rules for Christians regarding marrying someone who you're closely related to by marriage prior to one of them being widowed. Think a son marrying his father's widow, for example. But the two provisions, or impediments, to use the church's term, that I think would be most helpful for us, not that discussing things like perpetual impotence and sterility like Canon 1084 does isn't fun in a way, would be the issues of mixed marriages and issues of form, F-O-R-M. Okay, there are three categories of mixed marriages, by my count. First, while a Christian cannot marry a non-baptized person validly, two non-baptized people can marry validly. But once you're Christian, you're bound by sacramental rules. And as we'll see, if you're Catholic or Orthodox, you are very well likely bound to a subset of additional rules as well. Because membership has its privileges, and sacramental marriage and the graces that come with it, but it also has its requirements. And one of those, in the category of so-called disparity of worship marriages, being banned, is one of those. Second, there are mixed marriages, also called ones with a disparity of cult. Cult here means religious practice, not religion overall, or just a group with a strict set of beliefs. As a general rule, a Catholic cannot marry a Protestant without permission from the church. That permission, and any permission like it that waives a requirement, is called by the church a dispensation. A dispensation can be given by the church hierarchy, be it a bishop or even the Pope himself, on many issues. They only can't when the norm/rule is a matter of divine or natural law. So for a Catholic to get such a dispensation to marry a Protestant, assuming no other issues that would need fixed as well, 1, the Catholic has to show they are prepared to, and promise to, do everything, except for things like fraud/violence, to baptize and educate any children of the marriage in the Catholic Church. Now, 2, the non-Catholic has to know about that promise. Doesn't necessarily have to agree, just has to know about it. And both have to get the basic education needed on the ends/goals/properties of marriage, like we talked about earlier. And finally, there's a third type of mixed marriage, which is the special case of when a Catholic marries an Orthodox person, either Eastern or Orthodox. In that case, while the Catholic is supposed to get a dispensation, they need only get one for it to be licit or okayed by the church, but not for it to be valid. Put another way, the Catholic hierarchy doesn't like any of its flock going over and getting married elsewhere, but they would not dare say a Catholic marrying an Orthodox person in front of an Orthodox priest isn't as really and sacramentally married as if the Catholic spouse local parish priest had done it himself. Now, another thing you have to know about if you want to think about marriage the way the church does is actually connected to that third category. Specifically, because Orthodox priests are viewed as legitimate priests according to the Catholic Church, the Orthodox wedding, if it was done according to the necessary form of a Eastern wedding, and the people were free to marry, of course, then from a Catholic perspective, the Catholic was validly married, even if there were no dispensations for the sake of it being licit. Basically, this idea of form for the three key parts of canonical form are: 1, a sacred rite; 2, it was performed by / with competent authority; and 3, the witness requirements are being met. Now, if those three things happen, then there is no, quote, defect of form, end quote, and you're not getting an annulment on those grounds if you tried it in front of the tribunal. Now, that sacred rite part, that first one, for Eastern Christians, be they Catholic or Orthodox, is really important, like I said, because the priestly blessing is a necessary part of the wedding. The ministers remain the spouses themselves, but the importance, the holiness, the solemnity of the sacrament for Eastern Christians requires a priest, whereas for Roman Catholics, only a deacon, or even in certain circumstances, not even that, is required. As for competent authority, either the priest has jurisdiction over the would-be spouse / spouses, such as him being the parish priest for one of them, and it being at his church, or someone higher up, like the local bishop or the patriarch, gives the okay in what's called delegation. Without jurisdiction or proper delegation, you got yourself a problem / potential grounds for an annulment. The witnesses requirement seems pretty straightforward, so let's get into how one would fix something if there was a wedding, but for some reason there's an issue with it being sacramental, or there might be an issue. This is where two processes, convalidation and sanitation, come in. Because sometimes there's a problem with the supposed marriage, but the spouses doesn't want an annulment or don't want an annulment, and they, or the priest, want to fix it so everything is legit and sacramental. So let's start with convalidation. What's called simple convalidation is when an invalid marriage is fixed by a renewal of the exchange of consent by one or both spouses. Think of it as a redo of that particular bit of the ceremony / festivities. After that proper exchange of consent, aka them consenting after the earlier problem had been fixed, the impediment removed, to use that language, the marriage would be valid going forward. This process obviously involves one or both of the spouses. However, in some cases, the church can fix issues after the fact, once the impediment that prevented the marriage from being valid and sacramental at the time of the ceremony gets resolved. Indeed, it can be backdated, provided there was consent the whole time. Perduring consent, if you ever see that word or phrase. This going back to the root and cleaning up the problem is called radical sanitation. And because the church can do this on its own authority, technically, the spouses don't always need to be involved. Potentially not even know. So imagine the priest thought he had been properly delegated the authority to marry the couple, but let's say the wrong bishop granted it, and the correct one now wants to fix it. Well, this situation is different if one or both parts of the couple wants an annulment. Then they have to find one of these impediments, or one of the ones I didn't talk about, was both present and not dispensed with when consent was supposedly exchanged at the time of the wedding ceremony. Then they need to bring this case in front of a tribunal of canon lawyers acting as judges. Most, but not necessarily all of whom, will be clergy. And then they need to ask for the declaration of nullity. They need to seek an annulment. What's important here is that you do not need to have known about the issue at the time of the wedding and just gone on with it anyway. If one side is lying about their willingness to follow the rules for marriage, such as being open to have kids or be faithful, or, for example, if the man who says he's a priest was not one, or not one in good standing, or was not authorized to perform the ceremony there and then the supposed spouse has a good claim before the tribunal to have the union declared as having never been a sacramental marriage. And once the church does that, it has full and complete effect. You get that declaration of nullity, you can go get your marriage license right afterwards. Because again, this is not a civil divorce, just granted by men wearing a funny collar or colorful hat, instead of it being signed off by a judge, an elected judge in a robe. But rather, it is an examination by licensed experts into the nature of what really happened on your wedding day. That's why it's different. You can split your assets and still be married. But you can't be married and have never married. It is not a Catholic or Orthodox divorce. I hope all this makes some sense. And I hope I was able to give you a background into what the Christian, as opposed to legal, idea of marriage actually is. The sacramental sense of the term. This episode took longer to make than I expected, and I hope I haven't lost any of you in the audience, because I would really like to grow this show into what it can be. And if you can help me out there, I would appreciate it. One way you can do that is like, another is to rate, another is to subscribe to the Explain It To Me podcast on whatever format you're getting this show. It genuinely helps grow the audience. Also, if you could, tell your friends about what I'm trying to do here. Tell them to check it out. And as always, if you have any suggestions, questions for future topics, I can be reached at EITMPod@gmail.com. And if you're willing to help the show monetarily, you can use either Buy Me a Coffee or Ko-fi.com, ko.fi.com. I'm under EITMPod at both, and I have links for those in the description. Until next time, stay safe out there. God bless, and thank you for your time.